Zayn Parker sat frozen in his sleek modern office, the cold glow from his laptop screen casting harsh shadows across a face tight with restrained fury. But it wasn't the lifeless statistics in the latest employee satisfaction report that seized his attention. It was a single handwritten line scrawled in the margin, almost as if someone had slipped it in hoping it would go unnoticed. They fired Henry after 30 years. No warning, no severance, just gone. Zayn clenched his jaw so tightly that his molars ground against each other, the sound cutting through the silence like a blade. Henry Whitman. That name wasn't just another line item in payroll. It belonged to a man. A quiet, constant presence who had been the unseen backbone of one of Zayn's stores long before Zayn had even entered the world of business. 30 years. Practically an entire lifetime, and his career had ended, not with thanks or dignity, but with cold indifference. No goodbye, no decency, nothing. A crack spread through Zayn's sense of purpose like a hairline fracture across glass. When he'd bought the company 5 years ago, he didn't do it just to own a profitable chain. He did it to make it better. The previous owner had been infamous for treating workers like disposable parts in a machine. Zayn had promised himself and everyone who would listen that under his leadership people would be seen, respected, and valued. But now, someone had slipped through. And not just someone. Henry. The glossy corporate reports in front of him suddenly felt useless, just words on paper that told him absolutely nothing about the real heart of his company. He could no longer trust summaries or second-hand feedback. He needed to get out of the glass tower, step onto the ground floor, and face the truth with his own eyes. By the next morning, Zayn had shed every trace of the polished executive persona the world knew. He'd dyed his naturally dark hair to a dull, forgettable brown, let stubble creep across his jaw, swapped out designer suits for a faded hoodie, jeans that had seen better days, and scuffed sneakers that looked like they'd been through a dozen warehouse shifts. He even practiced hunching his shoulders, slouching just enough to blur the edges of his usually confident presence. To everyone else, he wasn't Zayn Parker anymore. He was Nate, a new janitorial hire. No one at this particular store had ever met the CEO in person. In a company this size, most employees only knew the name Zayn Parker from occasional emails or the bottom corner of company memos. He walked in unnoticed, blending into the backdrop like a piece of furniture. And the moment his sneakers crossed the threshold, he felt it. Something was wrong, not in the obvious way. It wasn't the lights or the layout. It was in the air, heavy, stale, oppressive. Employees moved like shadows, hollow, overworked, and utterly drained. Their faces wore more than just fatigue. They carried the weight of silence, of something lost that hadn't yet been named. Then he saw him, a stocky, balding man with narrowed eyes and the stiff posture of someone used to barking orders. The name tag on his chest read Rick, manager. Rick gave Zayn a lazy once-over before snapping. "You the new guy?" Zayn nodded, keeping his voice low, masking the command naturally embedded in his tone. "Yes, sir." Rick let out a short, mocking laugh. "Call me sir again, and I'll put you on all 3 shifts. We're short-staffed. Grab a mop and get started." Zayn gave no response. He picked up the mop as ordered, but his mind was already racing, burning with questions. Who authorized Henry's termination? Why? What happened to the values this company claimed to stand for? He had come looking for answers. What he found would change everything. Zayn walked through the store, mop in hand, his thoughts heavy and swirling. The name Henry echoed in his mind like a siren. Why had he been fired? Rumors weren't enough. He needed facts. He needed the truth. While his hands scrubbed the tiled floor, his ears stayed open, collecting bits and pieces of conversations floating through the aisles. Most of it was complaints, reduced hours, harsher rules, and how Rick had grown even more unbearable since Henry was let go. No one said it outright, but the feeling was everywhere. The soul of the store had left with the man they'd discarded. Rick, meanwhile, was the picture of indifference. He barked orders with thinly veiled contempt, then disappeared into the stockroom to stare at his phone, ignoring the growing line of customers outside. Zayn took mental notes, each observation sharpening his quiet fury. Then he overheard something that hit him like a punch to the chest. Cody, a young worker, was stocking shelves alongside Maria, a woman in her 30s. Maria sighed deeply. "I still can't believe what they did to Henry." Cody nodded, his tone bitter. "I gave his life to this place. Then one day Rick calls him into the office, tells him he's too old to keep up, fires him, just like that." Maria's eyes welled up. She shook her head slowly. "He begged, didn't ask for a raise, just wanted to keep his job, and they threw him out like garbage." Zayn's grip on the mop tightened until his fingers went numb. At that moment, he wasn't a CEO in disguise. He was a human being witnessing the raw cruelty of corporate neglect. Firing someone because of their age wasn't just unethical, it was illegal. It was an insult to a man's dignity. By the end of his shift, his sleeves were soaked with sweat, but his heart burned hotter than ever. On his way out, he gently pulled Maria aside, his voice low amidst the quiet shuffle of employees clocking out. "Do you know where he is now?" Maria hesitated, her eyes dimming with quiet pain, torn between honesty and heartbreak. "Last I heard, he's struggling, no savings, his pay was barely enough to get by. I think he's staying in some cheap motel." Zayn's chest tightened. It felt like someone had poured cold water on everything he had believed in, every value, every promise. A man who gave 30 years was now left to fade into the background of a world that moved on without him. No, not under his leadership, not while he still had the power to change something. He stood for a long while outside the store that night. The wind had turned cold, biting at his skin as if nature itself was mocking his comfort. But inside, his anger simmered, not destructive, but focused, alive with purpose. Every principle he had built this company on, respect, loyalty, humanity, had been violated. If a man like Henry could be tossed aside so easily, then what did Zayn's leadership even stand for? He pulled out his phone, typed Henry's full name into a search engine, and began cross-referencing it with nearby budget motels. It didn't take long, 10 minutes at most, before he found a lead. A rundown place on the outskirts of town, the kind of place people ended up when they had nowhere else to go. When Zayn arrived, the motel's neon sign flickered weakly against the black sky. The front desk was quiet, the night clerk barely looking up. The air was thick with the smell of cheap disinfectant and something sadder, stagnation. Zayn slipped a $20.00 bill across the counter and received the room number in exchange. He walked slowly down the dim hallway, heart pounding like a drum. At the door, he paused, drew a breath, and knocked twice. Silence. Then the door creaked open just enough for a pair of tired eyes to peek through. Henry, the man, was a smaller version of the one Zayn remembered, shrunken, worn. His once broad shoulders had sagged. His salt and pepper hair had thinned. Gone was the neat uniform. Instead, he wore a wrinkled t-shirt and faded sweatpants that looked years past their prime. There was no recognition in his eyes. To Henry, Zayn was just a stranger knocking on the wrong door. Zayn steadied his voice. "Henry Whitman?" Henry hesitated, then gave a small nod. "I heard what happened at the store. I just wanted to check in on you." Henry narrowed his eyes, suddenly guarded. "Who are you?" Zayn paused, considering his next words. He could lie, but Henry's eyes that had seen too many half-truths, deserved more than that. "My name is Zayn Parker." A flicker of recognition passed through Henry's expression. Then, just as quickly, it hardened. He began to shut the door. I don't need your pity. Zayn reached out, not to stop him but to gently hold the edge of the door. It's not pity. I need to understand what happened. Please. Henry hesitated, then let out a tired sigh and stepped back, allowing Zayn inside. The room was nearly empty, just a small suitcase slouched in the corner and a half-eaten sandwich sitting on the tiny table. Zayn didn't sit. He didn't feel like he had earned the right to. I should have been the one to tell you this from the beginning, Zayn said quietly, his eyes locked on Henry. I didn't know what had happened until today. Henry let out a laugh, but it was hollow, devoid of any warmth. That's the problem, isn't it? You didn't know. Zayn drew in a breath, letting the words hit him like a punch to the chest. I should have. Henry eased himself onto the edge of the bed, staring off into the distance. I gave them everything. 30 years, worked holidays, picked up extra shifts, never called out sick unless I physically couldn't move. And then one day, Rick calls me in and says I'm not strong enough anymore, that they need fresh energy. No warning. 1 minute I had a job, the next I was nobody. Zayn clenched his fists, his pulse pounding. Did he offer you any severance? Henry let out a sharp, bitter laugh. Severance, kid, I barely got a handshake. Zayn's stomach turned. He had personally written the company's policies to protect long-term employees. If those policies were ignored, then the failure was his. I'm going to make this right, Zayn said firmly. Henry looked at him with tired eyes. It's too late. No, Zayn replied, his voice unwavering. It's not. Henry didn't speak, but after a long silence he gave a slow nod. Not forgiveness, but maybe the faintest trace of hope. Zayn didn't leave until he had paid for Henry's motel room in advance for the next 3 months. Henry tried to refuse, but Zayn cut him off gently. I failed to protect you. Please, let me do this much. Henry finally gave a slight nod. As Zayn stepped out into the cold night, something inside him had ignited. Rick had chosen cruelty. Now it was Zayn's turn to make a choice of his own. Before dawn the next morning, Zayn was back at the store. But he wasn't Nate anymore. He was Zayn Parker. The automatic doors slid open. The night shift workers were still stocking shelves and glanced up in surprise. No one stopped him. His steps carried the weight of something more serious than a clipboard or a title. He walked straight into the back office. Rick was there, feet up on the desk, sipping coffee and scrolling through his phone. He didn't even bother looking up. If you're here to return the mop, just put it back where you found it, he mumbled. The door slammed shut behind Zayn. The sharp sound finally made Rick look up. His eyes narrowed in confusion. Who? I own this company, Zayn said, cutting him off. Rick's mouth dropped open, then snapped shut. He straightened in his chair, the smugness draining from his face, replaced by something more guarded. You are... Yes, Zayn said coldly. I've spent the past 2 days working under your supervision, watching, listening. Rick slowly set his cup down, his fingers tightening around the edge of the desk. Zayn answered, each word landing like a hammer blow. Not anymore. Rick blinked, then smirked. You're firing me over a janitor? Zayn took a step closer. Not just because you fired a man who dedicated his entire career to this store without giving him a single option, but because you slashed employees' hours without cause, because you sat in your office drinking coffee while your team scrambled, because you put your own comfort above the people who actually keep this place running. Rick's face flushed red. He jumped up, sending his chair skidding back. You think you're some kind of hero? Zayn didn't respond. He didn't need to. Minutes later, security escorted Rick out. The store fell silent as everyone watched their former manager disappear into the cold morning air, his muttered complaints trailing off into the tension hanging in the space he left behind. Zayn turned back to face the stunned crowd. He stepped forward, voice steady and eyes clear. "Some of you knew me as Nate, but my real name is Zayn Parker. I own this company, and for the past few days, I've been working alongside you to learn the truth." The room remained completely still. Maria stepped forward, her expression a mix of surprise and cautious hope. "So, what happens now?" Zayn took a deep breath. "Change." He looked to Cody. "How many people have had their hours cut?" Cody hesitated, then admitted, "Most of us." Zayn nodded, firm and resolute. "Starting today, anyone who wants their original shifts back will have them. No more short staffing, no more pushing people past their limits." A low murmur rippled through the group. The suspicion in their eyes began to shift, tentatively into something softer, something like belief. Maria looked at Zayn, her voice catching slightly. "And Henry?" Zayn's expression brightened just a bit. "Found him, and he's coming back." The atmosphere changed completely, like a breeze blowing through after a heavy storm. Maria stood still, her eyes glistening. Cody exhaled deeply. Other employees nodded, murmuring to one another, not in fear but in quiet relief. Zayn didn't stop there. He spent the next 2 hours listening, not just speaking but truly listening. Employees spoke openly about grueling shifts, the lack of respect, and the hopelessness of feeling invisible. Some were angry, others were just exhausted. Zayn wrote everything down. He made calls, issued orders on the spot. By the time the afternoon arrived, new policies were already in motion. But to him, this wasn't the end. There was still one thing left undone. Henry hadn't come home yet. The next morning, the store felt different. Employees gathered near the front, not quite working, waiting, their eyes fixed on the entrance, as if expecting something greater than just another workday. Zayn stood by the doors, heart quietly pounding, gaze steady. He had called Henry himself, told him clearly, "Your job is still here if you want it." And Henry hadn't hesitated. He had accepted. When the glass doors slid open, Henry stepped inside. No words were spoken, but the entire store held its breath. He wasn't the same man who had been forced out weeks ago. His back still stooped, his steps still slow, but there was something different now. A quiet resolve, a grounded calm like stone weathered by storm. He wore his old uniform, faded from years of use, but clean and carefully pressed. His rough hands curled slightly at his sides, eyes scanning every corner of the place he once called home. Zayn didn't hesitate. He walked up and extended his hand. Henry paused for a brief moment, then grasped it firmly. No words were needed. Maria broke the silence. She stepped forward, her eyes wet, her voice soft but unwavering. "Henry." She stepped forward and hugged him before he could react, quickly and tightly. Cody patted him on the back. Then others followed. Handshakes, soft-spoken apologies, and nods filled with respect. No one blamed him. There was only quiet recognition that what had happened was wrong, and that something right was finally being restored. Henry returned to work, greeted by small, warm smiles, subtle but filled with gratitude. No one said much. They didn't need to. Just meeting eyes was enough to say what words couldn't. Zayn gave them space, letting them have their moment. Only when the room settled did he step forward and gently explain the changes that were already underway. A new manager would be arriving soon, someone with real experience, someone with heart. Most importantly, someone who understood that a company's real value wasn't in its numbers or margins, but in its people. Wages would be reviewed, schedules adjusted, so everyone could actually live, not just survive. And the most vital change of all, no one ever would be discarded the way Henry had been. As Zayn spoke, Henry just listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't question. He simply took it in, and when it was all said, he gave a single nod. It wasn't forgiveness. Zayn hadn't expected that, but it was something. A beginning. The atmosphere in the store shifted. Employees moved with more ease. Quiet conversations picked up again behind the counters. The dark, heavy fog that had hung over the place seemed to lift with every step Henry took as he returned to his old post. He didn't need instructions. He didn't ask questions. His body knew this space. Every angle, every supply, every stubborn stain. But just as Zayn was about to leave, Henry glanced over at him. A small, almost imperceptible nod. But it carried more weight than any thank you. Zayn didn't leave right away. Something held him back. He wandered into the break room where employees came and went, grabbing quick snacks before heading back to work. Everything about the old, worn space felt different today, like it had meaning again. Henry was sitting at a table, carefully wiping down an old thermos before pouring himself a cup of coffee. His movements were slow, precise, like he was reacquainting himself with a ritual he thought he'd lost. Zayn sat across from him without asking. Henry didn't look up immediately, but he exhaled through his nose, a quiet acknowledgement. Zayn rested his elbows on the table, watching him. "I should have been around more," he said. Henry didn't respond right away. He brought the thermos to his lips, his hands steady with the weight of years. The only sound was the soft hum of the vending machine in the corner. Finally, Henry leaned back. "You ever work a job like this before?" The question caught Zayn off guard. He had expected frustration, maybe even anger, but instead, Henry's eyes held something else. Curiosity. "Not exactly like this," Zayn answered after a beat. "But before I started the company, I worked warehouses, fast food, retail. I remember what it's like to be on the bottom." Henry nodded slowly, as if evaluating the answer. "Then you know how easy it is to be forgotten." Zayn swallowed. The words hit harder than he expected. Henry set his cup down. "Managers come and go. Policies change. But the people who keep this place running, the ones on the floor, no one notices them. Not until they're gone." Zayn held his gaze. "That's gonna change." Henry studied him for a long time, then shrugged and reached for his thermos again. "We'll see." Zayn didn't push. Henry had every right to be skeptical. Change doesn't come from promises. It comes from action and time. The break room door creaked open. Maria stepped inside, pausing when she saw them together. She looked nervous, clutching a small, crumpled envelope in her hand. She glanced at Zayn, then walked over to Henry. "I know it's not much," she said, "but everyone on our shift chipped in." Henry frowned as she placed the envelope on the table. He didn't touch it. "What is this?" Maria glanced toward the hallway, as if hoping someone else might step in. No one did. She took a breath. "Better you got fired. We heard things were rough. A few of us wanted to help." Henry reached out, but didn't open the envelope. His expression was unreadable. Zayn watched his Adam's apple shift slightly as he swallowed. Then, Henry gently pushed the envelope back toward Maria. "I appreciate it, really, but I can't take it." Maria's brow furrowed. "Henry, I mean it," he said softly but firmly. "You all work just as hard as I do. You need that money for your own families." Maria didn't say anything. Then she gave a small nod and slipped the envelope back into her pocket. But she didn't leave. Instead, she pulled out a chair and sat down beside Henry. "At the very least," she said quietly, "let us have this. Having you back. That means a lot." Henry didn't respond. He simply looked down at his hands. The same hands that had gripped a mop for decades, now finally back where they belonged. Zayn rose from his seat. He had seen enough. This moment wasn't his. It belonged to them. As he stepped out into the hallway, he spotted Cody leaning against the wall. Their eyes met, and Cody raised an eyebrow. "Didn't think you'd actually come back," he said. Zayn gave a faint smile. "A Lutin?" Cody shrugged. "Guys like you talk a big game, then disappear. Things go right back to how they were." Zayn didn't argue. Cody had a point. He'd seen it too many times. Grand gestures made by executives that vanished the moment the spotlight dimmed. "I'll be back," Zayn said simply. Cody studied him for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. "Well, we'll see." Zayn left the store with a mental list forming. Clear, urgent, and far-reaching. Not just for this location, but for every store bearing his company's name. Policies would be rewritten, oversight would be restructured, and most importantly, no one would be treated as disposable ever again. Because Henry had been right all along, the people working quietly on the floor were the true foundation of any business. And if Zayn truly wanted to become the kind of leader he had once promised himself he'd be, this was the moment to start proving it. Not just today, but every day. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Moments of Quiet Truth, where we believe that the human spirit is never truly defeated, only waiting to rise.